Okay, guys, so this is your extra credit lesson. If you're interested in gaining a few points, there's going to be two parts to it. The first part you're gonna solve a problem on your own after I demonstrate an example. That'll be worth 10 points, and then you're going to take notes on how to get the quadratic formula. And that one will also be 10 points. So for the second one, all you're doing is you're copying notes from me. It's a little bit complicated, but there's your two things. So we're going to start with point one here, or part one. In part one, I'm going to do an example. You do not need to take notes on the example, but you can. I don't want you to turn that into me. But when I'm done with the example, I'm going to give you guys a problem to solve, and that's what you'll do. You'll work it out and turn that into me. Okay, so let's go ahead and start. The purpose of the problem is just to kind of help you really understand part two of this problem better. Part two is really confusing, but part one is meant to kind of help you understand part two a little bit better. So let's begin. So let's say that I had this quadratic formula, and I wanted to find the roots. Now, when it comes to solving quadratic functions, and you want to find their roots, the first thing you do is you set it equal to 0. Now, sometimes you can use factoring, but this thing doesn't factor. So we can't use factoring to solve this. The other way is with the quadratic formula, but we're not allowed to use that because right now I want to pretend that that doesn't exist. So there is a third way that we can use to solve this, and that's the method I'm going to show you. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to change it into vertex form. So you guys might remember this is what's called standard form. I want to start by changing it into vertex form. So to do that, the first step is to minus the 3 on both sides. The next step is to factor out the a. The next step is to complete the square. So we take half of that number, right, which is -2, and then we square it, which is 4, and that's what we're going to put right there. And then we also fix the balance. So if I add something on this side, I have to add something over here. And what we learned for that was to take the 2, multiply it by the 4, and then add that result over here. So 2 times 4 is 8, and that's what I'm going to put over here. The next step is to factor this, and I gave you guys a shortcut for factoring that a little while ago. It's always going to be x something squared. And that something is always half of that middle number. Okay? So this is what we have so far. Now, what's the point of completing the square? Because we're done here, or changing it to vertex form. That's the first part of this. Change to vertex form. Why do we do that? Well, look up here. Notice that in the beginning, when it's in standard form, you have 2 x's. But you can't combine them because one's squared and one isn't. But when you change into vertex form, now look, there's only 1 x. So that's kind of the magical move there that makes all this possible. Now, since there's just 1 x, we can actually just solve for x. So what would we do next here? Oops. We have 2. X minus 2 squared equals 5, right? If I want to solve for x, the first thing I would do now is I would divide both sides by 2. the next thing I would do is I would take the square root on both sides. And don't forget, when you take the square root on both sides, you get a plus and a minus. So on this side, these cancel, and I'm left with x minus 2 is equal to plus and minus the square root of 5 over the square root of 2. I'm just going to go ahead and break that square root up into two different square roots. Okay. And then the last step I need to do is I need to add this 2 over. Now we could get a common denominator. So right now, just to kind of put a few final touches on this, first of all, you guys might remember we don't like square roots on the bottom. So what I would do is I would multiply the top and the bottom by the square root of 2. Okay. That's going to give me the square root of 10 over 2. And then I want to be able to put this together as one giant fraction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this an over 1, and then I'm going to give him a common denominator of 2 also. So multiply the top and bottom here by 2. And I end up with x equals 4 over 2 plus and minus the square root of 10 over 2. And then as a final answer there, I can just write x is equal to 4 plus and minus the square root of 10 over one common denominator of 2. And there's my answer. Okay, so after you change it to vertex form, you solve for x, basically. Technically, we could have stopped here, but I thought it might be kind of interesting to put all this other stuff together by getting the square root off the bottom and getting a common denominator. Because look at our answer now. Doesn't that kind of look like an answer that you would get by doing your quadratic formula? Well, the reason why I'm giving you this problem is so you guys kind of see this is where the quadratic formula actually ends up coming from. But before we get to that, I'm going to give you guys your part 1 extra credit here. So here's your part 1 extra credit. I'm going to give you a problem now. And I want you guys to find the roots in using the same method that I just did. So the first thing you'll do is you're going to change it to vertex form, and then you're going to solve for x. So that's your part 1 extra credit. That's worth 10 points. So go ahead and pause the video, do that, and then part 2 will be waiting for you when you're done. So for part 2, all you have to do is just take notes on what I'm about ready to show you. So here's the deal. We have this. This is what's known as the standard form of a quadratic equation. Now, if I wanted to find the roots, the first thing I would do is I would set this equal to 0. And now I want to get x by itself. But notice I'm not going to put any numbers in here for the a, b, and c. It's just going to be letters the whole time. But what you guys are going to notice is that as I go through all this stuff, it's going to be the same exact steps that I just went through, but with the numbers. We're just going to be doing it with letters this time. Okay? So the first thing we want to do is change it to vertex form. The first step is to move the c to the other side. The next thing is we want to divide out the a. So a divided by a leaves 1a. And b divided by a, well, since those are letters, we really can't do any division, so we just write it as a fraction, b divided by a. The next thing we do is we complete the square. So to complete the square, the first thing we do is we take half of this, which means we're going to take b over a, and we're going to divide that by 2. And we end up with b over 2a. And then we're going to square it, which would be b squared over 4a squared. You square all three of these, that's what you get. And that's what we're going to put in there. B squared over 4a squared. After you do that, you need to fix your balance, right? So you take your a and you multiply it here. Now, if you multiply that, you basically end up with an a on the top, right? I'm just going to write this on the side. But I have an a on the top and on the bottom, so this a is going to cancel one of the a's on the bottom. And so what you're left with is b squared over 4a. And that's what you're going to add to the other side. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to factor. So, as I told you guys, when we factor, we always get x something squared. And that something is always half of the middle number. So half of b over a is b over a divided by 2. Okay? Now on this side over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a common denominator. So, because I want to put these together, because that's usually what we do here is we combine these at this point. But before I can combine them, I need a common denominator. So I'm going to put this over 1. And then I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by 4a. So if I do that, I end up with 4a times negative c is going to be negative 4ac. That looks familiar, doesn't it? Plus b squared all over 4a. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to reorganize that a little bit. So we have the following then. Instead of putting negative 4ac first plus b squared, I'm going to put the positive b squared in the front and the minus 4ac in the back. And now that should be looking a little bit more familiar, right? Okay, now what do we do? Well, the next thing that we would do is we would get rid of this a in the front. We do that by dividing a on both sides. So this cancels, and we just put another a down here on the bottom. So what that's going to give me then is x plus b over 2a squared is equal to that over 4a squared. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to square root both sides. Square the top and the bottom. Don't forget your plus and minus. This goes away like so. And so now on the top we have plus and minus this. On the bottom, well, the square root of 4 is 2. That's easy. And the square root of a squared is just a. So now we have plus and minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The last thing I need to do in order to get x by itself is I need to move this b over 2a over to the other side so I have x by itself. And now I have x is equal to negative b over 2a plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac also over 2a. And since they have a common denominator, I can just put them together as one big fraction. And lo and behold, you have the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula, that's where it came from. It comes from taking a quadratic equation in standard form, setting it equal to 0, completing the square to change it into vertex form, and then solving for x. And so we don't have to go through those steps like we did in part 1 every time we want to solve for x. Somebody just thought, well, I'll just turn this into a formula with letters in it so we can just always plug things in and get our answer right away. But that's where that came from. So that's part 2. So turn in part 1, that would be your answer to this question here. And then part 2 would be your notes on this section here. And that's it. That's your extra credit. See you guys Thursday.